Hi everyone, my name is Andrew Eck. Welcome to my talk, What I Learned About Code Review from Teaching 8th Grade Poetry. This is here for RailsConf 2021. So first, a little bit about me. I'm the founder and senior partner for a company called Arid Software. We use Ruby, Elixir, JavaScript, and a couple other things to make custom software for clients, mostly internal line of business applications, but not exclusively. And I'm based here in beautiful Lincoln, Nebraska, USA, on good old planet Earth. You can, if you feel so inclined, reach me at andrew@aridsoftware.com or at catastrophe, but with an ek in front, on Twitter or Instagram, where mostly I post about my cats and funny things my wife says. So a little bit about me. I'm a software developer. I've been in a senior software developer role for a number of years now, but my training is officially in education. I was a teacher. I taught English, math, and computer science at the middle, high school, and college level, respectively. And for a good portion of that teaching, I traveled around the state teaching poetry and creative writing and performance to young people. And so I want to talk specifically about poetry. I had a long-term residency over the course of a couple of years for spoken word poetry. That is to say, poetry that's meant to be read out loud instead of like read on a page at a high school here in Lincoln. And I was very fortunate in that I had a number of students who were super eager to write. And so when we think about writing, the way that I learned to write coming up was mostly like writing on my own. But then like I would submit an essay or a short story or whatever for feedback. I would get it back, I would have a bunch of notes on it, and then a grade at the end. And if I am being honest, I mostly looked at the grade. And then if there were points docked, I would go and see what those points were docked for. And that was it, right? Most of the feedback was not, here's how you become a better writer, here are different ways you might think about this, here are ways you might recontextualize this. It was, here's why I have given you the grade that I have given you. And then we're done. We move on to the next assignment. Life is fine. In college, same thing, but periodically we would have peer workshops where we'd be asked to give feedback on each other's work. And a thing, I found those of mixed use, frankly, mixed usefulness. Sometimes I would get or see given really excellent, actionable feedback. And sometimes it would be stuff that so completely missed the mark that I realize now that I didn't turn my lights on, that so completely missed the mark that, like no feedback would have been better, frankly. And so with that, so it's like thinking through this, in thinking through all of this, when I started teaching like in a conventional classroom, I did the same thing. When I left feedback, it was, here is why you got the grade that you got. There'd be a rubric attached, we'd circle stuff, the whole modern schooling experience, frankly. With this poetry residency, it was an after-school group. They weren't looking for a grade. They were looking to produce excellent work. And since it was spoken word oral poetry, they would stand up, they would read their poem. I would have my list of notes to give them. They would very diligently write down those notes and then sit back down and maybe or maybe not do something with it. And I noticed a couple of things happening. Thing one, I had a lot of really motivated writers, so that in like our 2 hours after school twice a week, we did not have time to get to everybody, much less multiple times. I would give the students feedback. They would maybe or maybe not do something in response to that feedback. But frankly, the soonest I'd be able to hear them again, just because we were working through the queue, would be somewhere between a couple of weeks and a couple of months, at which point probably they've written something else that they're more into. Probably they've written something better. Probably they lost the sheet that they wrote their feedback down on, or have lost the context for that feedback, or lost the context for the poem. Like something was lost, right? They weren't acting on that feedback. And the researcher Dylan William describes the best feedback as that which is acted on by the receiver. Like there's a bunch of articles like here are characteristics of really good feedback, really good assessments, things like that. And his And he kind of boils it down. A piece of feedback is useful or it's good if it is useful to the person receiving it, and it is not if the person receiving it either cannot use it or chooses not to for whatever reason. And those reasons can be multiple in nature, and not a thing that I'm going to address directly other than that, like the primary predictor of feedback usage is whether or not the person receiving the feedback trusts the person giving the feedback, which is entirely independent, in fact, of the person giving the feedback's expertise. So tying all of this back, what we noticed then was kind of a teacher-centric flow where students were standing up, they'd read their thing, I would give them a bunch of feedback, like this is what's going well, this is what's not going well, here's what you might think about. They would sit down, and in many cases, nothing would come of it. The students did get better over time, but I'm not sure that that was an effective feedback. And the big thing that was happening was we had a lot of idle time. We had a lot of students who were just kind of sitting and hanging out, and they were just waiting their turn, which isn't what you want for an after-school club. Like standing in line and waiting your turn is a useful skill, but it wasn't the skill that we wanted to practice here. So I talked with the teacher who was sponsoring this club, and what we decided to do instead was to have students break up into small groups and give each other feedback, so that way they could act on it. Like, I'm going to perform this thing, you're going to give me feedback, I'm going to try again, attempting to do something different. And that was better in the sense that the students were more engaged, they were more active, they were each able to read their thing more times. But a thing that we noticed then was that the quality of feedback varied drastically. Some of the feedback was next to useless, some of it was very useful, and it was all over the place. And what we also sometimes saw was feedback that was at the wrong level of abstraction. And I'll give you an example of this. If I write an essay, and the fundamental thesis of the essay is factually incorrect, it's not going to be useful for you to go through and correct my comma usage or to make sure that my punctuation, my verb tenses are all perfect, because what I really need to do is scrap the whole thing and start over. Similarly, if I write an essay or a poem or whatever, and you have no idea what's going on in it, it's probably not useful for you to be giving me feedback about performance notes or things that I might tweak to do just a little bit differently. So we sat the students down and we asked them questions like what works well, what doesn't work well. And with feedback, when they were reading their poems, the feedback that worked best was first, do you understand the poem? To you as the audience member, because you don't have the text, you're listening to it, you don't have the chance to go over it again and again, you don't have the chance to look things up. Does it make sense to you? It doesn't mean that all the details are filled in, but it does mean is there enough there that you have something to anchor yourself into? The second thing that they were looking for was some sort of emotional journey. And that doesn't mean necessarily deep emotions. There are lots of intensely funny poems that students wrote, things that were sad, things that were heartbreaking, things that mixed the sad and the heartbreaking and the hilarious in this beautiful cacophony of feelings. And but the question was what emotions am I as an audience member feeling in response to this? What am I thinking in response to this? And only after those things were cleared up did we start worrying about word choice or line choice or even after that performance notes. And when we did that, we noticed that the level of feedback got better. And the thing that was happening, if I'm able to say, what I think your poem is about is your relationship with your mother. And you say, wait a second, no, it's about my relationship with the tree in my backyard. I don't know where you're getting my mother in this. That's a good signal, because then we can ask about that. We can say, well, what things caused me to misinterpret that? Can we make this more concrete? Did other people have the same misinterpretation, or am I just on my own on this? If we can interrogate the experience of the listener and the experience of the reader, or the experience of the audience in this case. That we had cases where I can't tell if this is a joke that's supposed to be funny or if it's supposed to be darkly funny. Oh no, it's actually sad, knife twist. Those are that's a good thing. That's a good question to ask, because then it means that we are paying attention to the experience of the person who's on the other side of this. There's a thing that I noticed with my students, and even in my own work, I made my living for a couple of years as like a poet and a performer, or a portion of my living, I should say, not all of it. It's not always like I know exactly what I mean when I write something and when I'm performing something. It isn't always clear to me if the audience knows exactly what I mean. So I have to give them enough that they can kind of hook in on that. And so, and more generally, like I know exactly what I mean, but there are a million ways that something might be misinterpreted or reinterpreted or like off kilter interpretations. And so it's important to check in with that. I mean, how many conflicts have been caused by somebody saying something that another person took to mean something different than the intent of the speaker, like the intent versus effect. There's a number of those cases. And so it's just like a function of being people in the world with ambiguity. So we started going with that. And what we noticed when students were giving feedback from the perspective of, as an audience member, this is how I'm making sense of it. These are things that I'm confused about. These are things that took me out of the moment. The work got better. And that was really cool. The next level to this, so this was in the early 2010s, so about 7-8 years ago, and students they had smartphones with cameras on them, and so like the next level of that, like we noticed, like the feedback was getting better, and when I say better, I mean it was something that like the poet performing could act on. The next level of that was to have them record their own performances, and then sit down and watch. So that way it's like, when you did this with your hands, here's how I interpreted it. Here, it was distracting. When you did this gesture, when you did this thing, when your voice did this thing, it took me out. This was really effective. This was not effective, and so on. And so we were able to give the poet the experience of being in the audience of themselves. So they had a chance to, like, when they were performing, they could just think about performing. They're done, they step away, they sit down with a group of 2 or 3 classmates, clubmates, fellow poets, whatever. Then they watch this recording on a smartphone or a tablet or whatever the case may be. And then they can say, yeah, I see what you see. I understand how that might be unclear. I understand how this might be really effective. I understand, like, it really leveled up the whole thing. And so what is the, and so I'm going to, yeah. So it's a relationship with software development, I guess. I took a very dramatic pause there because I was trying to decide where exactly I wanted to go. But what is the relationship with software development? And I think some of it is that, like, as a software developer, when I'm writing code, it is super clear to me in my brain, hopefully. It's a knowing look, hopefully. It is super clear to me in my brain the exact business problem or technical problem that I'm solving. But if I go back and I look at it a couple of months later, a couple of weeks later, a couple of years later, if somebody else goes and looks at it, they think, man, what was this? I don't understand the point of any of this. I don't understand why this code exists, why it's shaped the way that it is, why this thing is handled or not handled. We can get clues from comments in code. We can get clues from the tests, but it's not always clear. And there are things that can further hamper that readability. Things like mixing your levels of abstraction. Things like not using descriptive method variable or class names, as the case may be. Things like drastically shifting paradigms or making use of a lot of magical things. We've heard the accusation, which is not entirely unfounded, that Rails has a lot of magic, and yeah, it does. And so not understanding that can make parts of the code base really hard to parse. And so what I'm getting at here is that as software developers, sometimes we focus so hard on the code that we're writing that we don't think very much about the experience of reading that code, or the experience of trying to make sense of it, the experience of trying to figure out how it fits within the broader framework of what we're trying to do. Going back to my poetry kiddos for just a second, what we had at the beginning, the old ways, was like that low throughput. There were only a couple of poems that could be read in the given day. I could only give feedback on so many. There's a lot of idle time because most of these students were just sitting and waiting. There's a super long feedback loop. Sometimes a student would write something, and then it would not be until a couple of weeks later that they would get their first bit of feedback on it, at which point all that like built up like brain context probably has evaporated. And that's not at all a diss on high school students. It's true even of me. Like I might write something and think, oh man, this is such a good line. I'm so smart. I'm such a good looking poet. And I go back and look at it a couple of weeks later. It's like, man, I don't understand. I remember being excited about this, but gosh, I don't remember anything that I actually meant to do with this. So, whoops. And so with that lost context, and then the other piece is that it meant that I was the bottleneck. You know, I was the ship blocking the canal, keeping all the other little ships from coming through because everything had to wait for me. With our newer way, that is to say, breaking the students up into groups, we had faster cycle time. Where cycle time in this case is the time between like starting a piece of work and when it is finished. So the students weren't waiting weeks or months before having a chance to get enough feedback that they could say, yes, I am done, I feel good about this. It was instead, a couple of days, sometimes a couple of weeks, depending on the state of things, but it was like a constant couple of weeks rather than an idle couple of weeks. The feedback loop was way tighter, and the thing that we found was that once we started being really intentional about the types of feedback that we gave, and really intentional about the ways that the students were giving each other feedback, there was no drop in quality. There's no drop in quality between like the feedback that the students could give and the feedback that I would give. There's a little bit, but not a meaningful. Nothing that actually reflected in the scope of work. And also like in the cases where students were stuck, they're like, man, I have this poem. I don't know. I'm stuck with it. I don't know what to do with it. Like that's where I was able to step in and help. I have this thing and it's pretty good, but I want it to be great. That was where I could step in and help. But just getting something from like good to pretty good, or like starting to pretty good, the students were largely able to do that on their own. And it was awesome. And what we saw was that they were doing more work, better work, and it was really exciting. And so if we think about this from a context of like code review, my first developer job, when after I made the career shift from being a teacher to being a software developer, I had a senior developer that I was working with, and code reviews, like pull requests, I guess, waiting for review would just kind of pile up. And he would do a great big review binge about every 2 or 3 weeks. And it was okay. But what happened was typically by the time he got to a piece of code, a proposed change, I had maybe forgotten like the original instigating thing. Like I knew I put a fix in, but I didn't document what the bug actually was. So who knows? And so there are a number of cases where, or the code base had like it had, or a pull request had been stagnant for long enough that the code base had since diverged, and then it was no longer worth it to even try to merge it back in. So there were a number of cases of things like that, where just like that long cycle time, that long feedback loop, that long just like gap between when work was started and when it was delivered meant that the work that I was doing was lower quality. And this isn't a knock on the senior developer I was working with. I also wasn't that great of a developer at that time. And so there are things that, that I could certainly, that now I do better, and that at the time I could have done better, and still things that I can do better. But yes, that was kind of where it was. In my next job, I was on a team with a couple of other like mid-level engineers in a PCI regulated environment. PCI is the payment card industry, so we were storing and encrypting credit cards, running payments, things like that. And so what we had a team rule that every single change, no matter how small, had to be signed off on by at least one other developer. And if it were a change around encryption, card data, mechanisms of encryption, log in and log out, things like that, anything where there's a potential security vulnerability, then it had to be signed off on by at least 2 other developers. Sometimes 3, depending on the change, depending on like how core it was to security and the scope, and whether its scope like directly affected our PCI audit process. when we started, the team lead was the person who signed off on those things, and he was and still is a great developer, a good manager, super busy. So code would wait. But what we ended up doing was shifting to where it was like that democratic peer review, along with letting our senior developer know if we thought something was going to be of interest to him, namely if it was one of those like more secure areas. And as the team went along, when we started, I didn't make this connection until recently, but when we started the code review, our process was like, yes, this is good enough. No, this is not good enough. But as we progressed, as we started to both concoct and discover patterns, as we started to take more ownership of the code base, a thing that ended up happening was in our code reviews, we started asking a lot more questions than we did saying things like this should be changed. It was, is there a better name for this? Can we discuss this pattern? And what that meant then was that it was more collaborative. What that meant then was that by asking these questions and having these conversations, it was not dictum from down on high, like from on high, I as the senior developer mandate that you as the junior developer change this. It was I as a peer have questions that you as a peer, and we can talk through them and come to some level of consensus. And that was really exciting. And so, we started with the idea of catching defects, catching mistakes, catching security vulnerabilities, catching anything that would compromise the integrity of our data. As you do not recover in PCI land from leaking credit card numbers. You do not recover from leaking access to credit card numbers. Like none of those things are recoverable from, at least for the scale that we were at. So we were looking first to catch those defects, catch those things that would prevent a payment from going through or that would compromise the integrity of the payment system at large. But then with the implicit goal, you're looking at this editorial process, right? And so the notion of an editor is somebody like you're writing an essay, you're writing a poem, whatever. Your editor's job should be making sure that whatever it is that you are writing and working on is the best version of itself. So not just are your commas in the right place, not just are you not using global variables or whatever the case may be, but is this the best or some approximation of best version of this little artifact of work? And so we adopted this implicit goal and made it explicit. The idea that what we are doing is looking to improve our own work and each other's work in finding the patterns that help us to move more quickly, more securely, more stably, more confidently is perhaps the thing, more securely. Our goal was to, can we write our code in such a way that anyone on the team could sit down and within a couple of minutes know what was going on within a given file and what its purpose was and what problems it was solving. Can we write our code in such a way that reading through the code makes sense and tells stories? And the answer is often yes. And there are different patterns and different code bases and things that work better or worse in different contexts. But the answer is yes. And so with this editorial process, it was, how do we inch ourselves closer to that? How do we take what right now is the very best that we can do and push it just a tiny bit, but also get work up to closer to that level? It was really exciting. Along with that code review, we were in that particular environment, we had, I believe, 17 distinct microservices that all talked back and forth. So it was a fair amount of code. And there were 6 of us who were contributing to the code base on a regular basis, which meant that it was tricky to maintain an accurate mental model of the code. And pretty much no matter what, right? I mean, you've got your understanding of the code, and the code as it actually exists will always diverge with time unless you've got some sort of photographic eidetic memory kind of thing going on. I do not. You may. And so but your understanding of that will always always or almost always diverge with time. And so by reviewing each other's work, we kept that divergence corrected. We still diverged, don't get me wrong. Like there's still cases of like, whoa, I don't recognize any of this. Time to check the Git blame to figure out who I should ask. And that's okay. Like that's natural and normal for a group that's moving quickly. But what it generally meant was that the group consensus of the mental model was pretty accurate, which is really exciting. Along with that too, like when your mental model is accurate, when you've got the shared understanding that comes with this, we also have the opportunity to share power. On that team of 6, there were 2 of us who are senior engineers, 2 mid-level engineers, and 3 of us, I guess, who are senior engineers, 2 mid-level engineers, 2 junior engineers. And so with that, we were able to take those junior engineers and say, hey, would you please look at this code for me? Would you please ask me questions? Would you please interrogate it? Can I teach you more about how this code base works? And can you teach me about the experience of reading this code for the first time so that I can make it as readable and as understandable and as correct as possible? And so what that meant then was that we had a pretty rapid leveling up that happened. In a way that I think would have been more rapid, was more rapid than if we were all just working in our own little silos, or if that code review process only went up. I only ask people at the layer above me to review my code. They're not like sharing power. There's like, you got to have it going both ways in order to level. That doesn't necessarily mean like a flat org chart. It doesn't necessarily mean a flat hierarchical structure. There are, in some cases, meaningful differences in skill and ability and the types of skills between like senior and junior engineers. But the job is to like bring everyone up a little bit more because that raises everything for the whole team. And so when we think about this, like my core thesis, or the core thesis of code review, we're catching these defects in code. We are boosting our understandability. We're ensuring that the mental model is more accurate. And we're trying to build this avenue towards sharing power and building team cohesion. And code review is, I think, a part of that. But as I've progressed in my career, and this has kind of surprised me, I did most of my research on this, comes from the world of teaching and feedback giving and things like that. As I've progressed as a software developer further, as I've like pushed these ideas further, a big thing that I think helps with even more with building team cohesion, sharing power, catching defects early, putting an emphasis on readability is the notion of pair programming, wherein it's basically like live within a keystroke code review and collaboration and planning and building. And I think that captures even more the heart of what I'm wanting to accomplish. But knowing that 100% pairing is neither feasible nor practical for many organizations, including my own. Like I do a fair amount of pair programming, as do like my coworkers and employees, but we don't do it 100% of the time. It's probably closer to 40 or 50% of the time. And so knowing that it's not feasible, code review like still fills in the gaps. It's a step. It gets you closer towards having that confidence and knowing that you've got this team moving in the same direction. There's also, some like project planning stuff that goes into this too. But yeah, that's the thing that we want. We want this group of empowered developers who say, yes, I can solve a problem and I can have somebody else check my work. And it's a totally fine, friendly, healthy thing where we're just going to do it because we like each other. We want to see each other succeed. We want to see the team succeed. That's a really cool environment to be in. So when you think about takeaways, the first one I think is establishing the shared language and expectations. With the payments group, we had a pattern of interactors or service objects, whatever you want to call them. We had the service layer on top of our data access layer and below like our external interface, the API endpoints and whatnot. And we had shared language for this. With my poetry students, they had shared language for talking about the turn and tone of Volta, or like what their voices might do. So the vocal dynamics or gestures or how they might use their bodies or voices or facial expressions or the words on the page. They could describe those things in precise terms. And because we all knew what that meant and had taken the time to build that vocabulary and to kind of concoct it and devise it, we were much faster. with being able to give each other feedback. The next thing I think, and this is more pertinent to code review than it is to poetry, is to prefer smaller changes. The effectiveness of code review, that is to say the likelihood of catching a defect, goes down pretty drastically after a change reaches about 200 lines of code. Think about this, right? If you have a 10-line pull request that you need to review, you can give each of those lines your full attention, and you can pay attention to it, and it's not going to overload you. If you have a 10,000-line pull request, unless it's like a bunch of boilerplate, there's no way that you can give each of those 10,000 lines the same level of scrutiny that you can give each of those 10 lines. It is not possible. Or if it is certainly not efficient. And so in preferring smaller changes, and this does require, in some cases, reworking how you plan your work. And so not thinking about like this branch is to deliver an entire feature. It's this branch is to deliver a tiny slice of a feature. If you're doing like trunk-based development or something like that. Preferring smaller changes makes the review process more robust, makes it faster, it makes it more effective, frankly. The next takeaway, I think, is that if you're wanting to do this, regardless of whether or not you've got like the managerial buy-in from the folks up top, an obstacle for code review is that like it takes too much time, it puts too much of a load on the senior engineers, et cetera, or in some cases, like individual developers don't feel that sense of security or do feel like this parochial sense of ownership or territorialism over the code that they write, and so are resistant to change. And so, you gotta get used to getting your ego out of the way, which is challenging sometimes. That's, that is why, one of many reasons why we might go to therapy. And so, but a thing that we can do though, is we can ask for those code reviews, regardless of what management says. It is easy to do, like the formal code reviews, like you're sitting down, you're going through line by line by line by line. Modern code reviews, the idea that you're like using tools like GitHub, for example, and pull request, evaluating, commenting, or the equivalents on GitLab or Bitbucket or whatever. There's also the ad hoc code review. Hey, come sit down with me. I want to show you something. Can you please tell me what you think? Like that is easy to do and flies under the radar of management in most cases. Or pair programming, right? It is not that bad to say, hey, I'm working on this tricky problem. Would you mind come sitting with me and we can just pair our way through it? That is not, it takes practice, yes. Pair programming is a skill, but that type of thing does not disrupt an organization's workings, especially if it means that you're producing better work that not only does not have defects now, but later can be changed and can be understood, can be read with relatively little fear of misunderstanding or of introducing defects or things like that. This is what these processes are for. Another, and this is kind of an ironic one, paradoxical, I should say. It is a paradox. There's a conflicting statement, yet true, is that code review is usually more effective when you have fewer comments. If, think about this in terms of an essay. You submit a 10-page paper or whatever to a teacher, and they mark it up, and there's ink all over the place, right? There's just every line is marked up in a bunch of different ways. How do you tell which things are more important and which things are less? It's not really possible. On the other hand, if there are 2 comments, it's pretty easy to say, these are the 2 that matter. The Netlify folks, I think this is an essay, I think I saw this post via Swyx, Sean Wang, SWYX on Twitter. But the Netlify folks have a method of categorizing comments on code review where there's a boulder, this is the thing that needs to be handled immediately, versus a rock versus a pebble versus a grain of sand. I don't remember the exact taxonomy, but it is, this is an important comment. Please treat it as such. This is a matter of preference. You can take it or leave it. I don't care. And so having even that level of indicating what things are or are not important is useful. But I think generally leaving fewer comments both makes the review process faster and makes responding to those comments easier. I am more likely to use a piece of feedback if there are 3 of them I'm more likely to use those 3. Whereas if there are 300 pieces of feedback, are all of them useful? Are all of them necessary? Do I even like have time to address all of them? Maybe, maybe not. Within feedback, there's the notion of usefulness. That is to say, a usable piece of feedback, or the usability of a piece of feedback, is determined by whether or not the person receiving it uses it. The usability density, or the usefulness density, is of the corpus, of the set of notes left on a piece of code review, on an essay or whatever, how many of them are used, how many of them are acted upon. If it's a small number, your usability density is very low. If it's a large number, your usability density is very high. And so when we when you think about that, that gives us some kind of evidence that maybe we should prefer fewer comments. We can also audit our code reviews. So periodically just asking, and this is true of every process that you have, you can introspect on the process. We're doing these things. Are they working for us? Are there places where we wish they would work better? Are there places where we should stop doing something because it's not working at all? And so, the question of do we make an iterative change versus a revolutionary change is, situational. But you can audit your code reviews. You can look through them and ask how many of these pieces of feedback were actually acted on. How useful is this process? What would make it more useful? What would make it less useful? These are questions that you can ask and that you can investigate, which is really exciting. And so I don't know of formal tools for this, but GitHub stores pull requests basically forever, even after they're closed. So that's you can at least do some back of the envelope calculations. But yeah, I think that's probably my core thesis here. The big thing, if I a single takeaway, is that certainly if you are not using code review as a means of sharing knowledge, checking the readability of your code, and ensuring the quality of code, that is to say the correctness, it may be worth starting. That's unless you are working with me, that decision is completely and totally up to you. And if you are doing that code review, the suggestion that I will have is to think about how you might do that. I'm going to start this over again because I had a time. The other thing that I might suggest is that I would suggest that you might think about how you might go through and do that code review process, because it's really cool. Okay, I'm Andrew Eck. Thank you so much for being here. I'm looking forward to talking with you during the Q&A session.